Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast. This week, special guest, I've got Simon Davis with me. Hello, Simon. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. For anyone who doesn't know Simon, Simon was a commercial litigation partner at Clifford Chance for 26 years. And then you became president of the Law Society of England and Wales up until 2020. And you will become a master of the City of London Solicitors Livery Company in 2 years' time.
Perfect.
Simon, it's lovely to have you on. I think let's just dig in straight into the questions, really. So I think looking at kind of the legal industry and how it's changed in the last few years, obviously, there has been quite a lot of change overall across jurisdictions. In your view, what are the biggest challenges that law firms and their lawyers are facing nowadays?
I think if I just say to promote what hasn't changed, the job of lawyers is to keep people out of trouble.
Yeah.
And that's whether it's an individual with terrible mental health issues, right the way up to a massive global corporation. I don't want to sound too sort of evangelistic about it, but the City of London just wouldn't function were it not for top-class lawyers putting together complex, workable transactions. So that hasn't changed. We're out there providing solutions to clients and helping them keep out of trouble. And that, I don't see that ever changing, I hope. What's changed is the struggle actually just to focus on doing that job. Just providing really good advice to clients. So the hats now, which the modern partner in a law firm, I just focus on partners because I think that's particularly relevant for the moment, but of course it spans throughout the organizations. So if you just look nowadays, first of all, if you just look at the external influences on a law firm, and I'll focus for the moment on government, comes no surprise in the last few years, focusing on the city, my specialist subject, city lawyers have variously been described as sanctions busters and enablers. At the same time, those of our profession who specialize in working for those unfortunate in the immigration front are described as ghastly sort of lefty lawyers. So we've had a very negative narrative. So hat number one, your modern partner has effectively to be a lobbyist to make sure they're out there getting across the proper narrative about the role of city firms adding value to clients and to the UK PLC as a whole. Secondly, now before you do any piece of work, in most law firms, you have to have a detailed price negotiation with the clients, often involving procurement departments. So now you have to have somebody who's effectively a fee negotiator and project manager. Then you have the multiplicity of issues which affect a law firm today, and indeed many other organizations: mental health, climate change, diversity, social mobility, COVID, working from home. So the modern partner has to be pretty much a specialist in pastoral care and making sure that people are really, really looked after across a series of quite conflicting issues. Pay. The pay levels have now soared. Most recently, you can see one law firm is about to pay £70,000 a year for a trainee. I'm not going to sound too much like an old man, despite your introduction, but my first salary was £4,250 a year, and there's therefore a fierce war for talent. Always has been, but now you've got money in it. So now you have to effectively be a kind of recruitment consultant. And the last couple, now with the advent of not just AI, but legal tech before that, making sure you understand digitalization, how to search documents just using machines, you have to be an expert in to an extent in legal tech. Then you have extensive regulatory involvement. The regulators have greater and greater appetite. So you need to be a compliance manager. And last but by no means least, there's regularly issues which are happening which affect the reputation of cases you're involved in, and you have to be effectively as a PR consultant. So I would say that what's changed is the need to do so much more than just providing, which is really difficult anyway, a top-class, innovative solution to a client who's in the proverbial.
I wonder if actually that kind of multitasking model for partners at one point will break down, because obviously they're not necessarily experts in, compliance for tech and all that stuff and recruitment and whatnot. So I wonder if at one point that might actually break down, but
It's an absolute perfect question. There are firms out there, the large ones, who are well resourced and who spend a great deal of time protecting the lawyers in the firm and enabling them to focus absolutely on their day job. So a large firm, the Clifford Chance being an obvious one, will have many people whose job it is to look after most, if not all, of the subjects I've just been talking about. And to an extent that's very helpful, but it still doesn't take the partner out of it. It just means that you have a whole series of people who are minimizing the stress and involvement of you, enabling you to focus on the client. But despite what you read, not all law firms are massively well resourced.
Absolutely.
So you start to move to areas where it's not necessarily just size, but effectively some kind of resource. And you think the strain now on some of the smaller firms who are having to deal with so many of these issues, regulation being an obvious one. You're having to have an officer who's going to be dealing with compliance, going to have somebody who's going to be a specialist in making sure and looking after money laundering. Now you're going to have people ensuring that you're covering that all the areas of, it's the hugely important ones, of diversity and social mobility. So you start to say, well, hang on, if I'm quite a small firm, something's got to give here. And I think therefore you are going to see not so much fragmentation, but I think a growth in outsourcing of various functions to try to make sure that the modern law firm of any size can cope with the demands which are now placed upon them far beyond providing a solution.
I think for US firms as well, in the UK at least, it's interesting as well because they run their BD operations in a more lean way than UK firms, for example, international firms, and it's just interesting combining that with their modus operandi for the partners of, eat what you kill. I think for them that might be even just, not just the smaller firms, but just kind of the US firms here. I think that's something to kind of cope with over time. Super interesting. I
think that's absolutely right. And of course there are increasing transatlantic mergers. And inevitably there are going to be culture shocks on both sides, taken very much by surprise. And part, I hope, of the due diligence of anybody who is contemplating a merger is to sit down with a potential merger partner and says, what's going to surprise my lot about you? And vice versa. And one of the surprises, I may have changed, I'm a bit out of date in relation to the US law firms, is that US law firms' attitude was very, very lean, in the sense that if you talk about business development, the modern law firm will have a series of people whose job it is to help partners to generate business. And many of them actually out there generating business themselves. If you go back to the eat what you kill, you may find, and again, that may have changed now, but a US partner would say, I don't need a business development department to bring business to me. That business comes to me. In fact, I'm turning work down. And sorry, are you saying that my pay this year is going to be reduced by the business development department operating, say, globally, not just in New York? I mean, the ones who are operating in London and the ones who are operating in Frankfurt and Hong Kong, I've got all the costs of all those business are going to come out of my pay package. Yes. That's an interesting discussion to have.
So it's going to be interesting. Would you have any advice for kind of leaders at law firms in regards to any of these challenges at all?
I think that the key is that something sometimes happens. My own experience is when lawyers move into management, that everything that they normally do with clients, sometimes, by the way, this is obviously going to be a gross generalization, but sometimes they forget what they would do if they were acting for a client. and they suddenly start acting as if they've forgotten what a lawyer actually does.
Yeah.
And what they would have done as fine lawyers would have been to establish facts and develop a coherent narrative on a particular subject. That's what you would do. And of course, you flex that narrative from time to time, and you test it internally on a number of people. But you'd have your narrative, and you'd be able to stick to it. I think often, because management is being pulled in so many directions, they only have time to develop that narrative, but they need to find someone who does. And that, I think, is the real key. So if you're about to go into a merger, whether you're coming from the US side or the UK side, get your facts. What's going to take my folk by surprise? Yeah. And what's my narrative on it? How am I going to explain to somebody who's upset about paying for business development why business development inures to the benefit of the whole firm? And indeed, as the firm expands and there are more clients coming in and the reputation of the firm spreads, okay, that person may still be getting work, but might start getting really different kind of work. Yeah. Might start getting work from international clients that they think, hey, this is really interesting. Yeah. And I would never have got that if I'd just been using my domestic reputation. Once you start to develop that kind of narrative, things become much easier. But as I said, Meg, sometimes things just going so fast that people don't have time. Just remember, you're a lawyer. Lawyers develop compelling narratives. What's yours?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Moving on to actually the London market in particular. I mean, obviously, especially in the last couple of years, we've seen quite a lot of change here. I mean, you mentioned the pay war earlier. I mean, and that's my own terms, but I think we're seeing an Americanization of some UK firms. I mean, A&O Sherman, they might not like that, but the fact is they did much with the US firm. Freshfield's kind of rebranding following its expansion in the US. What do you make of all these changes, in particular with the Magic Circle firms? Or I don't know if we can even use that term anymore.
I think that term really should be consigned to whatever NAF phrase I can think of, but because there's so many fabulous law firms in all over the country and in the city. I think that in relation to the United States, that sometimes it's important to remember that law firms don't exist in isolation. Yeah. They don't just wake up one morning and say, hey, let's open an office in the United States. It looks like a really interesting place. They are motivated by clients, either existing ones or potential ones. So once you understand that, and then you think about the United States. The United States, after the financial disasters back in 2008, moved quite fast to clean up balance sheets, to sort out their capital, to really get fit. Yeah. And frankly, I think, and I don't think the UK and Europe did. And their regulatory regimes, I think, adapted much better than ours had. So when you think about that, so now you have this massive powerhouse in the United States, which does business not just in the United States, but all around the world. If you're a law firm, such as the large ones, where you want to act for that kind of large American institution around the world, then you can first of all do it by having offices around the world where they operate. But that leaves their home market, which is enormous. So it makes complete sense for somebody who has an international practice. The United States is going to have to be a really powerful part of that. So that's why you start to see people having New York offices, very similarly, or indeed offices elsewhere in the US. That's why you see the US firms having very similar attitudes. We want to act for our clients, not just domestically, we want to act from around the world. Yeah. You can start with having nice sort of friendships with the rest of law firms, and from some firms that works really well. But after a while, you start to think, well, actually, I think it's much more efficient for our clients if they know we're all going to talk to them with the same kind of attitude and language as theirs. Yeah. I don't mean American, I just mean the language of the client. You understand the business. Yeah. So then the challenge is, but hang on, careful, because the US market is not just ferociously competitive, but is full of wonderful law firms who have deep cemented relationships with these American clients built up over, I hesitate to say centuries, but a long, long time. Yeah. So I think you'll find a natural home for UK or international firms outside the US used to be, well, what we'll do is we will major in all the work outside the US, and we'll have a sort of foothold in the US to try to do some of the work, particularly which has an international element.
Yeah.
I think what you're probably now seeing is, well, is that enough?
Yeah.
And I think some firms are taking the view that isn't enough, but on their own, they will not be competitive in the US market for the reason I've given. Therefore, the next step is merge with a US firm, and that fills in the domestic gap. Perfect. But just you have to watch, getting back to my point about the surprises which happen between two really quite different approaches to not necessarily to lawyering, but different approaches effectively to how a law firm should run itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because I had Rose Walker from Bloomberg Tax on last week, and we were talking about kind of these, how it affects internal culture at law firms when such big events happen, merger and acquisition, rebrand, restructuring, whatever it may be. It's just fascinating to see how easy it is for firms to get it wrong. On many aspects of it. This brings us to the next question, I guess, which is obviously there's been a lot of focus in recent years around, ED&I, social mobility, mental health and well-being, challenges within law firms. From your point of view, what are they doing right and wrong, and what can they do to tackle the issue better?
First is it's going to sound a bit trite, but it's incredibly difficult to get this right.
Yeah.
And I think the real challenge is try to keep things simple and practical. So it's easy to generate all kinds of pieces of material which say how seriously you are taking all these various issues, and don't you worry, this is right at the top of our agenda, and we love you, and we take the environment seriously. I think what's much better, again, getting back to my analogy with the client, you wouldn't sit there with a client and just say, in relation to the problem they're in, oh, I've dealt with this so many times before, all's going to be well, everything's going to be safe, and you're going to have a fine outcome based on my experience and track record. Well, that's a start for the first 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Much better is what are you doing practically? And I think actually, wearing the various hats that I've worn and do wear, that I think law firms actually are doing a pretty good job of taking this really seriously. There's always going to be somebody who will say, well, look at that law firm, they say they're going to do this and they haven't.
Yeah.
But nobody really should be a counsel of perfection. The real question is, are they putting the effort in? I think you can judge that by what practical steps they're taking. So I think the advice I would give to law leaders, not they need it because they're doing it, is on any of the issues of the day, have a narrative which explains what you're actually doing.
Yeah.
And then test what you're actually doing to see if it works.
Yeah.
So more action, less talk, more dinner, less gong.
Yeah.
I think that's what I would say, because lawyers, just as me, a fine example in this podcast, can talk for hours. But the real question is, what are they actually doing when they're not talking?
Yeah, and I think a lot of firms in recent years are kind of, let's say it will be virtue signaling, because I think a lot of them have put, targets in place and whatnot, which I don't think is necessarily wrong, but I also don't think that really measures the success of inclusion within a firm on a day-to-day level, and kind of the success of retention of that diverse talent as well, and progression of their career. So I think it's interesting because I do think it's important that at the recruitment level you have that kind of thinking, but also I think the issue that people are seeing is that progression, and we're seeing it for women, we're seeing it for Black lawyers and Asian lawyers, and and I think even on the mental health and well-being side, I remember when I was a reporter at law.com, a lot of firms were coming to us saying, oh, look at that, we've got, on every fort we've got someone to speak to if you've got a mental health challenge. And I'm like, but quite often a lot of people don't even realize they've got a mental health issue for a long time. And I think there's just an awareness thing that's not really happening. And so I think it's all well and good to have some structure in place and kind of guidelines and kind of targets to meet and whatever it may be. But I think actually on the day-to-day level, it's more complex because everyone's going to have different needs. And I think that's particularly difficult, especially the bigger you are, I guess, the harder it is to get right. But it's fascinating that there's just so much focus still on this, and they're trying to find so many new ways to tackle the issue.
Yes. I think, try not to stray into too much controversial territory, but I think whatever the issue is of the day, that whether it's race, social mobility, mental health, then you do start to see an industry of consultants springing up. And the consultants, if they're listening to this, have said, well, that's because there's this need. And I get that. But I would say something slightly different is that, okay, consultants, you can always add value. But what's really useful is talking actually to other firms. We all have very similar issues. And that's why I'm also going to plug them. But it's a right to do so. The Law Society regularly holds round tables on the issues of the day. Likewise, the Livery Company, and we're going to be doing that increasingly. It's sitting around with other firms saying, not in any kind of odd, sort of anti-competitive way, but how do you deal with these issues in a practical way which actually delivers results? And I do think there's often law firms think that they just need to come up with the answers themselves. And I think more sharing of experience and challenges with others would help an enormous amount. And then I think also it's important not to just focus on, rather like the NHS, only looking after somebody when they've come into the hospital with something wrong with them. It's much more important, I think, as has been shown by the recent Darcy report, to focus on what brought them in the first place. So a law firm saying, if you have mental health issues, you can speak to so-and-so. It's well, but isn't it more important? That's when something's gone wrong. What is it you think within your law firm which risks causing mental health problems for people? Understanding that there is a different generation, not one which is different in terms of not wanting to work hard. That's tosh. But you're regularly dealing with people who have come latterly out of a COVID environment, deeply unsettling, probably has caused them an enormous amount of stress. They're probably going to be arriving also with a substantial amount of student debt. These are very different cohorts to the past, to when you had grants and the like and didn't have COVID. So these people are more at risk. So what is it you as the law firm do in the way in which you allocate work, in the way in which you check how much work people have, to be talking to people and saying really early on, is there anything, by the way, in the appraisal context, is there anything, by the way, in which your work life operates that you find really tricky for you? Not one that's causing mental health, because I think a better phrase, in my own view, is how you keep people mentally fit. Mental health, it sounds, it's still got a pejorative whiff about it.
True.
How do you make sure that people are mentally fit? And I would be talking to people and say, what is it in your work life and maybe your home life? If you're allowed to ask that question, you ask them, can I ask you about that? And that gets rid of that worry. Can I ask you about, is there anything in your home life, work life combined, which is causing you, stress, unnecessary stress? By the way, if you're working in a law firm or as a sole practitioner, you're going to be dealing with clients who are in terrible situations, massively stressful situations. If you don't experience stress, then perhaps something's going rather wrong. You are going to be experiencing stress. The question is how that's managed and how you look after yourself and not try to take stress out, because then that's a whole another topic, but that would be wrong way to head. How do we reduce stress? No, it's how you manage a stressful situation. And I think I would have the individual approach, try to avoid general statements which apply to everybody, but in fact only apply to some people and like to aggravate some people. Sit down with people individually. You can do it because we give law firms give individual appraisals regularly to individual people about their work. I'd be asking them, what in your work life on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, things you're having a bad time, and I think you'll get a pretty good answer.
Fair point. I think fair point. I think maybe there's not enough communication of that type.
Yeah.
Within teams, and then just maybe at a wider level as well.
I think that's absolutely right. So I'd move it away from the firm blanket policy level, which of course you have to have.
Yeah.
But move it much into the tailored individual approach, as you would with a client.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to touch a bit upon litigation, as that used to be your practice. And to me, it's been really interesting to see that actually lawyers' conduct has been under a lot more scrutiny from the public, but also from the regulators. Recently, I mean, obviously, the post office inquiry, I think, has highlighted that a lot more this year. But I think even before that, there's been issues around slaps and the NRC case against the SFO, which was settled this week. It's interesting because that highlights, obviously, some alleged misconduct on behalf of some of the lawyers involved in that case. So it doesn't happen often, or at least not that we know in public. But do you think that maybe the litigation landscape may have gone too far?
Well, using your own words, it doesn't happen often. I think what happens is actually quite pleasing that it happens so rarely that it does attract such massive publicity. Yeah. Because it is rare. Not to say it doesn't happen. Of course it does. But what is it? I think you just need to understand, looked at through the eyes of a litigator, what their life's actually like. I'll focus on litigators. This is what this discussion is, as you say, really about. So people bring legal proceedings, by and large, not as their first step. Yeah. By and large, after any attempts to try to resolve a situation have failed. It's their last resort. The feelings which a person has for the other, whether you're talking about a divorce or whether you're talking about a massive antitrust case, feelings are running very, very high. Yeah. And that's your challenge immediately as a litigator, because most or many clients will want your correspondence to be something you can only handle with tongs. It's going to be really, and if you as a lawyer say, okay, well, wait, here's my letter I'm writing to the other side. Yeah. Dear sirs, thank you for your letter of 27th of November. We disagree with the points you have made for the following reasons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We look forward to hearing your response after you've taken instructions. There are many clients may say, but this person is trying to tear me a new blunk, blunk, blunk. What's this? It looks like it's written by some goddamn butler. And you're going to have to, this is the real nub of this. And I think where things go wrong is either where you're inexperienced or you huge pressure from a client. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to make the client happy. And there's an old-fashioned phrase, which is, do not ride your own client's charger, which means like a battle horse. But it basically means is don't start taking the client's cause to your own. Yeah. That is where things go wrong, because if you've got a client who wants to send blistering correspondence and absolutely torture the other side, and you start becoming the client, then you've got problems. But it's really glib and easy for me to say, but really tough when you've got a bunch of people sitting around a table saying, this person's behaved appalling. They have defrauded me. My family is destroyed. Yeah. You're now going to comply with the rules and regulations of being reasonable and kind and decent. This is not easy. Mm. And the fact is that if we can say trials, most cases, the overwhelming majority of cases are settled. Yeah. So that starts to tell you that if you're looking at it from the position of a judge will have a distorted picture of the litigation landscape, because they will see the ones which are unsettlable, the intractable, the real horror. And surprise, surprise, you're going to see some pretty blistering correspondence in that, because people are often frustrated they're even getting to a trial. Some people may say, well, the reason it's gone to trial is because they keep sending this blistering correspondence. There's probably some truth in that too. But this is not a negative picture. Lawyers are doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
They're resolving the cases. And if we were dealing with things in such an appalling way, then we wouldn't be such a jurisdiction of choice for dispute resolution. And I don't just mean people who come from Russia or whoever we like to say are the kind of people who are going to generate slaps, but from around the world.
Yeah,
people come to this jurisdiction because they think they're going to get a fair hearing. They're going to be dealt with some really top-class legal professionals, and they're likely to get a resolution from and as I've said, overwhelmingly likely not one which involves them being torn to pieces in the witness box. So I think we need to be very, very careful in not running a narrative that somehow litigation lawyers across the piece are acting in a way which is improper, and I certainly don't think it's one where you should have. You obviously need to have regulatory involvement nowadays in just about everything in the law firm. I'm not saying they shouldn't be involved, but they need to tread very, very carefully before trying to work out whether they think a law firm has overstepped the mark.
Yeah.
Because somebody may say, of course I couldn't possibly comment, but there's somebody who's received some correspondence from the regulator may say, do you know, I don't think that was the calmest, nicest, sweetest letter I've ever received.
Yeah. But I think everyone gets that at one point in their career, right? So,
yeah.
I mean, I think it's just kind of part of the game, really.
Well,
at what point does it become unethical, I guess, and completely a breach, really?
Yes, I wouldn't say it's part of the game, but it's that sometimes, let's be very clear about it. If you have a person or company on the other side who is resisting all kinds of settlement over shares, and you think is actually behaving pretty badly, they will certainly need a pretty robust letter which takes them out of their socks to say, you keep on behaving like this, there's going to be some pretty poor consequences for you. And I want you to read this very carefully. Somebody receives that might go, oh, I think that's a little bit tough. I'm not making, by the way, light of this at all. But sometimes in order to have people see sense, you're going to need to be pretty darn robust.
It's interesting. I mean, I think going back to your point about taking on the client's cause as your own, I do think in the cases that I've mentioned, that's probably what happened in a lot of these, and potentially as well, like personal gain as well for some of these people. But it's just fascinating to me. And I mean, in a way, I kind of think, as you said, it's really good that there is scrutiny when things do go wrong, because you need to trust the profession and the professionals that are advising you. So I think it is key that it's happening. But it is fascinating that the regulator especially has been really cracking down on that. I think there are a few SRA investigations into alleged slaps, which none of them have come to anything as of yet. But that will be interesting to me if there is any firm that ends up being in trouble, or any lawyer being in trouble.
Yes, and I'm never going to advise the SRA, because they're a very competent bunch. But what I just would say, as indeed I think the Law Society has been saying in this context, is follow the evidence. Mm-hmm. Is there really a problem? And then, can that problem, as I think the answer is yes, be dealt with within the legal system itself, in the context of our rules and the context of judges' power? And I'd be saying, to the extent this problem exists, really only get involved if this really is the last resort. Yeah. That would be my maybe. And I suspect that if they were sitting here, they'd probably nod their heads. Well, maybe they would.
Who knows? Moving on to the last question, what would be your advice for young lawyers coming into the industry?
Coming in, the water's lovely. It's a fabulous life. I mean, if you imagine trying to work out what you're going to do in your life, and somebody says to you, well, how about you're going to be able to spend time with some really interesting people who have really challenging problems. You're going to get them out of that, and their lives are going to be transformed by what you have done for them. Does that sound interesting? And at the same time, you're likely, depending on the nature of the work, you'll travel, see the world, deal with all kinds of international problems. And by the way, you're going to get well paid at the end of that. But it's at the end of it, not the first.
Yeah.
And I'd say absolutely go for it. But, work hard and play hard. Make sure it's just going to, again, easy advice. But just work out how you're going to make sure that you're doing all this work, but at the same time, you're seeing friends, you're playing paddle, and as you move on, that you're looking after your family. Again, just work out yourself what's your own narrative. And that's very important. And then you're going to need to make sure you've learned to delegate quite early on, to share work. If you're absolutely swamped with work, but you know a fellow trainee who hopefully been chatted over coffee is complaining they don't have enough work, well, maybe say to the person who's giving you the work, you say, actually, I can't do this, or I say can, but it's not going to be as good as I would like, but I happen to know that Naomi down the corridor is looking for it. Is it okay if I get her involved? I think the partner's going to say, great, yes, please. Not just work harder and harder.
Yeah.
Work out how the ways you can share the load. But I think you do have to take some responsibility for yourself.
Yeah.
Not just either buckle, say, I've just got too much work, or say to the partner, I just can't take on any more work, because you leave the partner in the proverbial. What are they going to do now? Yeah. Look for solutions. Chat to those other trainees. And that works all the way up to when you're a partner. Speak to another partner. Say, can you take on this aspect of the case? Because I can't. I'm swamped. Be honest about it.
Amazing.
Well, not amazing, but...
No, but I think it's fair advice. It's good advice. Again, coming back to communication.
Yes.
Between people.
Communication between people.
I think a lot of people just kind of forget. They're like, I have to get this done, and
yeah,
I'll just get it done.
Yeah.
Even if they're at the end of their week and they're tired.
Yeah. And I've done that and probably still will. You just think the answer to this, I'll just work harder. But at some stage, that's going to give.
Well, Simon, on that note, thank you so much for joining us this week. I really appreciate it. And
thank you, Meg.
And to the listeners, we'll be back next week for another episode. You can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week. We'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.